Welcome back. After issue 140, Spider-Man underwent a small but significant change. What was it? What do you think? This is an interesting comic and very much one in two halves, although the whole thing still deals with the murdered pawnbroker storyline from the previous issue. The first half does so entirely without Spider-Man and is 100% street level. Then the second half, he returns from the Secret Wars, wearing an alien symbiote costume that he got on another planet that itself was stitched together from bits of other planets by an intergalactic godlike being. Anyway, on with the street level. This comic was brought to us by the regular art team of Greg LaRocque on breakdowns and Mike Esposito on finishes, but the writing team was far from regular. For almost the last 20 issues of this series, there was no regular writer, but this issue takes that up a notch, because one of the two writers from the previous issue, that's part one of a two-part story, has been replaced, as Bill Mantlo makes way for Jim Owsley, an interesting chap that we'll look at more in the future. Tom DeFalco is the other member of the writing team, and he does remain from issue 140. Of course, this is the first cover of Marvel Team Up to feature the alien suit. At the end of issue 140, we saw gang member Cool Breeze arrested but then exonerated for the murder of Mr. Zelnick, a pawnbroker. At the start of this issue, Cool Breeze is still in the police station being interviewed in relation to other crimes. His lawyer is there, so is Matt Murdock, who is defending a former gang member that's been framed for the murder. We get a little slice of street talk from Cool Breeze. This is 1980s street talk. So he says things like, "You got the wrong dude, man." And, "Sure, we took the place down for what we could get once the riot started, but dig, we had no reason to kill him." Once they've finished trying to question him, and all the different parties have gone their separate ways to get a bit of downtime, Ben Urich turns up. And he is a friend of Matt's, and he also knows that Matt is Daredevil. Thanks to Ben Urich, we get given a recap of the previous issue's events. And then Matt, because he's feeling quite frustrated, bails on Ben, just as Ben is getting a cup of coffee out of the machine. And he goes to stretch his legs in the guise of Daredevil. While Matt is taking part in his rooftop acrobatics, he thinks, among other things, about the fact that Spider-Man took a real interest in this case at one point. But then he vanished, along with numerous other superheroes. And this is obviously a reference to Secret Wars that was going on the same time that this comic came out. Daredevil wasn't a part of Secret Wars, which is a shame because I think he would have fitted in well. I can understand why some of the more powerful superheroes weren't included, because they would have tipped the balance too much in favour of the heroes. But Daredevil would have been okay. The funny thing is, of course, there was actually a figure of Daredevil in the Secret Wars toy line. So why wasn't he in the comic? Well, apparently Jim Shooter, the writer of the comic, was given a list of the characters that were getting figures released in the first wave, and they all had to be included. Daredevil wasn't one of them. Now, because there were so many characters in the Secret Wars storyline, he thought, do you know what? If I'm not given the name of a specific superhero, then I don't have to include him, and I'm not going to, because that's just going to confuse things even more. So he didn't include him, not realising that actually Daredevil was going to come out in the second wave of figures. Meanwhile, the Black Widow revisits the pawn shop, and she meets the new owner. Now, he's got members of the gang tidying up, it seems, in the pawn shop, which he says he's doing just as a kind of a community thing. She thinks he knows who the killer is, but for some reason he's protecting them. The question is, how can she make him talk? Elsewhere, Matt has found the gang's hideout, and he's making utter mincemeat of the gang members. He's beating them up, trying to get information out of them. Eventually, one of them says he will talk, he'll tell him anything he wants. However, he doesn't know the identity of the killer. What he does know, and what he does tell Matt, is that his defendant is not quite the reformed character that he's making out to be. We see Daredevil and Black Widow swapping notes, and she tells him her suspicions regarding the new pawnbroker. And at that point, Spider-Man returns. We see a local man, Mr. Wilkins, being interviewed on the news, and he recounts Spidey's return, which we saw firsthand in issue 252 of The Amazing Spider-Man. We see that nearby, Spidey is still in Central Park with Kurt Connors. He finds that a bird has made a nest in the clothes that he left behind when he left for Battleworld, and then he decides to swing back home. The next day at the Daily Bugle, Peter is in great spirits. That is until he speaks to Ben Urich, who tells him that the lad that Peter thought he had got off of the charge of murder at the end of the previous issue hasn't got off the charge at all and is still in the frame. This means that for the second time in one issue, Ben Urich is left mid-conversation when he goes to get a cup of coffee. Peter leaves him and changes into his new costume in his really cool way. Not only that, but once he gets swinging, he fires the webs from the back of his hand, which is so cool. He ends up at Matt Murdock's office, where Foggy Nelson and Becky Blake both fail to recognise him, despite the fact that he wisecracks like Spider-Man does, that he knows who Foggy Nelson is, and that he sticks to walls. Eventually, maybe because he's got a massive spider logo on him, Becky guesses who it is. And she says, "Foggy, I think it's Spider-Man, in a silly outfit." A silly outfit? Oh my god. Don't you realise that is arguably the coolest superhero costume of all time? Spidey is there to see Matt, but Matt isn't there. So he bails on the two imbeciles who couldn't recognise him. He swings across town and ends up at the gang's headquarters, where, watching from the shadows, he sees them loading a load of stock into a van before driving off. It is all clearly very suspicious, although he does concede that, of course, I could be wrong, and Gary Coleman could be a KKK High Druid. Moving on, so Spidey follows the van, and still watching from the shadows, he sees the van arrive at the pawn shop and the goods get unloaded from the van. It's at that point that he realises that the new pawnbroker, Mr. Arnold, is actually in cahoots with the gang. Not only that, but while he's watching, one of the Kingpin's lieutenants turns up. And this lieutenant announces to Mr. Arnold that he knows that Mr. Arnold is the guy that killed the former pawnbroker. Mr. Arnold stammers that he didn't do it and that the guy's got no evidence. But this guy, the lieutenant, points out that the Kingpin, he don't need no evidence. It turns out the lieutenant is right. Mr. Arnold is the guy that killed his predecessor. The previous pawnbroker wasn't exactly a straight arrow. He knew the gang and he acted as a fence to sell on a lot of stolen goods. Mr. Arnold wanted in on the action. Mr. Zelnick said no, he wasn't interested. So Arnold had him finished off. Then he came in and took over the business. Mr. Arnold breaks down and admits all this. He confesses to the Kingpin's lieutenant and, of course, within earshot of Spider-Man. Just as it looks like the lieutenant is going to off Mr. Arnold, Spidey swings in to save his neck. Then, just as he starts laying into the Kingpin's men, who else swings in to break things up but Daredevil? And you've got this great picture here of the two heroes, Spider-Man in his so cool black outfit and Daredevil in his red outfit, which pretty much always looks really good. Now Spidey thinks, result, there's now two of us to take out all these goons. But he's in for a surprise, because Daredevil stops him and says that the Kingpin's men are under his protection. Now while all this is going on, Mr. Arnold tries to sneak away. And he does okay, because he gets away from Spider-Man and Daredevil, but then he walks down an alleyway and who's there but the Black Widow. Seeing her, he hands himself in along with the murder weapon. Meanwhile, Daredevil explains to Spider-Man that he struck a deal with the Kingpin, and it's because of the deal he struck that the Kingpin's men were able to get this confession from Mr. Arnold. And that's now why he wants Spider-Man to lay off of them, because that was the deal that he struck. Spidey, of course, really isn't happy with this, and he swings off and leaves Daredevil to it. And it is interesting, there's a few times over the years that these two have come to blows or have really disagreed with each other, despite the fact that the pair of them both are pretty straight down the line and they both want justice. But there are a few occasions where they both go about it in different ways, and this is clearly one of them. The next day in court, we see the case dismissed for Matt Murdock's client, so he is finally off the hook. He is overjoyed. Matt isn't quite so happy, and his client, Juan Santiago, says to him, "This is great, why aren't you happy?" And Matt says, the fact is, I know you're not as straight and as clean as you were making out to be. You still have enemies in the old gang, and they're still going to come looking for you. And actually, you'd probably be safer in jail. And as he leaves, even Natasha, the Black Widow, notices that Matt isn't himself. And she asks why that is. And he says, something Spider-Man said to me last night. Something about justice. I've got a lot of thinking to do. Naturally, Spider-Man is perched on a nearby building, watching over them. And he's kind of satisfied. And he swings off. But he's a little bit miffed. Because he says, I wonder why he never said anything about my new suit. Which is a really good ending for what is basically a really good comic about what is right. And it's made all the better by Spidey's new suit. The next 2 issues take us on an adventure of a very different nature. Our old friend and future creator of Carnage, David Michelinie, takes over writing duties on issue 142 when he pairs Spider-Man with Captain Marvel to save the lives of everyone on Earth. Then in the following issue, 143, he teams up with Star Fox to save Captain Marvel's humanity. For a review of those 2 issues, you'll have to look for my series on the alien suit. We then return to the mean streets of New York in issue 144 as Spider-Man teams up with Moon Knight, and that tale is written by the closest thing that Marvel team up had to a regular writer at this point, Carrie Burkett. His is not a well-known name in Marvel circles. He only ever wrote 8 issues for them, and 5 of those were Marvel team-ups. He did the bulk of his work at DC, where he honed his team-up talents on the likes of The Brave and the Bold and the world's finest comics. Moon Knight is appearing here in the days before he was an Avenger, in a tale that revolves around a struggle for power in Chinatown. The pair of them go up against an adversary that Spidey has met before in Amazing Spider-Man, issues 184 and 185, the White Dragon. In issue 145, Spider-Man travels to Cleveland, Ohio for an engineering convention. Whilst there, he meets up with old friend Iron Man, who at this point is piloted by Jim Rhodes, whilst Tony Stark is sorting out his own personal problems. This is actually the 8th time that Iron Man has shared top billing on this title. Tony Isabella is the writer for this one, in a tale that sees Mark Scarlotti, aka Blacklash, down on his luck and hoping, in vain, to turn things around. I've said it before and I'll say it again, Iron Man always looks good on covers. But the next issue we're going to look at is issue 146, that features the one-time alter ego of Steve Rogers and the then alter ego of Jack Monroe, Nomad. We are back to having Carrie Burkett as the writer on this one, and there's a real Captain America vibe to it. Not just because of the presence of Jack, but also because of the presence of sometimes antagonist, the Taskmaster. This also is the comic that features the very last appearance of the alien suit in Marvel Team Up. We begin this tale with Spider-Man helping out at the site of a car crash. And it's nice to see him actually being appreciated by the authorities for a change, instead of them always trying to arrest him, even when he's done a good deed. That does get a bit grating after a while. Not only are the paramedics and the police officers gazing on in appreciation at what he's doing, but so, in the crowd, is Jack Monroe. And as he's watching him, he's thinking that he bets that someone like Spider-Man doesn't have a care in the world. Of course, we know otherwise. Once Spidey's finished dealing with that accident, he changes into his civilian garb by the process of a mental command, of course, at the moment. And he's taking a shortcut along an alleyway when he runs into a group of people called the Butcher Dogs. Sound friendly? Peter knows, as well as we do, that he can easily take on this gang single-handedly. But if he does that now in his civilian guise, he'll give away his secret identity, which he doesn't want to do. Luckily for him, help is at hand, because Jack Monroe appears. And between them, they see off the gang. Peter, of course, is holding back. Not sure why, though, because as you can see here, Jack Monroe at one point picks up a gang member and throws him about 30 feet into one of the other gang members. Nonetheless, the two of them do drive off the gang and they all run away. Whilst doing so, one of them, a young lad called Tony, who is trying to impress the gang, hurls a rock in Pete and Jack's direction. Then he runs off, so they think, whatever, leave him to it. Anyway, they meet for the first time now, shake hands, and they strike up a bit of a friendship and decide to go to the cinema together. Okay. Later on, when they leave the cinema, wouldn't you know it, but that little runt Tony sees them and he follows them. And then when the time is right, he runs in and snatches away a package that Jack Monroe was carrying for a commercial artist friend of his. That commercial artist friend is Captain America, Steve Rogers, in a career move that I always thought was just a bit weird. Anyway, the two of them chase after Tony and the package. And of course, in doing so, he goes down an alleyway. So what do? They split up. That, of course, gives them both the opportunity to change costumes. Jack changes into his costume of the Nomad, and Peter, with again a thought, changes into his cool alien costume. And by the way, this marks the last time we see the alien costume in this title, Marvel Team Up. Unfortunately, both chasing after this kid independently ends badly as they get in each other's way, and Spidey ends up getting Jack caught in one of his webs. This means the little kid that these two superheroes are trying to catch, scuttles off. There's a brief discussion between the two of them, and they agree, yeah, let's work together to bring down this little kid. And I think Jack sums it up well when he says, this isn't exactly how I imagined working with Spider-Man. So what's going on? Well, the gang from earlier, the Butcher Dogs, apparently were on their way to a big inter-gang meeting that was called by the Taskmaster. Now he offers to train all of those gang members present so they can earn some real big money. But he points out that he won't actually be the big boss because he himself is working for somebody else, the Black Abbot. It's at this point that little Tony runs into the meeting carrying that package, and he's calling out to Deke, who is his hero from the Butcher Dogs. But once he says that he's being chased by Spider-Man, Deke isn't happy because the last thing he wants is Spider-Man to be turning up at that meeting. However, one person that is happy is the Taskmaster, because back in Marvel Team Up 103, Spider-Man, along with Ant-Man, broke up one of his operations. So he sees this as an opportunity for revenge. And that's not all. You will remember that this is an inter-gang meeting, and one of the gangs there also wants revenge on Spider-Man. Why, I hear you ask? Well, as one of them says, we owe the Wallcrawler a little something too, Sly, for the way he beat on us and took in our buddy, Cool Breeze. Yeah, Cool Breeze, the guy with the Mohican from issue 141. At that point, Spider-Man arrives in this alleyway. However, all the gang members are hiding, but as he lands there, he is suddenly subject to a barrage of arrows. And we get one of these great panels that you used to get quite a lot, especially in Spider-Man comics, but you don't get so much these days, where in one picture you see the same character half a dozen times as it shows him acrobatically somersaulting through the scene. Just as Spider-Man gets his footing, all of those hidden gang members spring out and attack him. Now obviously he's doing okay, not even breaking a sweat dealing with them. But then Taskmaster steps in and fires off one or two trick arrows. One of them contains gas, and Spidey falls for it. But just as he succumbs to the fumes, Nomad turns up, and he throws his weight into the melee. Tony, the little runt from earlier, is watching on, and suddenly he's looking at what Nomad's doing, taking on all these gang members, and he's impressed, especially as he doesn't have any superpowers. At this point, one of the gang members throws a petrol bomb at Nomad, which he barely dodges. While he's distracted by that, Taskmaster steps in, and Taskmaster is more than a match for Nomad. However, he isn't more than a match for Spider-Man, who's now recovered from the effects of the fumes. And as he returns to the foray, Black Abbot makes his move, and he hits Spider-Man with a psychic bolt, which racks his whole body with pain. So now both of the superheroes are down. And it's at this point that one of the gang members says, do you know what? This isn't what I signed up for. I don't want any part of it. And he intends to leave. The Black Abbot says, well, don't leave, you should stay. But the gang members are saying, no, I want to go, I want to go. So the Black Abbot takes it up a notch. He reaches out, touches him, and dissolves his whole body to ash. As you can imagine, everybody watching is awed by this. That's the gang members and Nomad. But the Black Abbot hasn't finished yet, because he now advances on Spidey, and he reaches out, and he's going to dissolve Spidey into ash. But at that moment, Nomad picks up Taskmaster's shield, which is based on the design of Steve Rogers' shield, and he hurls it so it lands between the Black Abbot and Spider-Man and reflects the Black Abbot's dissolving powers back on himself, on his own arm. This buys Spidey a moment of time to recover, and while the Black Abbot is dealing with his injury, Spider-Man goes for the Taskmaster. Now, the Taskmaster's power is that just by watching someone, he can copy their abilities exactly, as long as they're not superpowered. And now, as he fights Spider-Man, he uses the abilities, for example, of Iron Fist and Daredevil. Nonetheless, he's intelligent enough to know that the odds of him winning this battle are dropping rapidly. So he gets out while the going's good. Shortly after he leaves, the gang member who threw a petrol bomb at Nomad earlier throws another one at Spider-Man, but he misses. Nonetheless, it explodes against a building, causing part of the building to collapse and the rest of it to begin burning. And it's at that point that Nomad sees that in that building is Tony, the little kid from earlier on. Tony is trapped underneath some timbers and he calls out to his hero, Deke, from the gang. But Deke wants nothing to do with it. He needs to get out of there and save his own ass. Nomad, of course, has a different psychology. So he climbs into the burning building. He lifts part of the rubble off of Tony, but then the pair of them look up at the wall and that begins to fall towards them. But then it stops. How can this be? Well, what do you think? Spidey is perched on the other side of the wall, holding up with his sticking powers. This buys enough time for Nomad to carry Tony out of the building before inevitably it all collapses in a burning heap. It looks like both the baddies have got away. Spider-Man does a little reconnoitre of the area and confirms, yep, there's no sign of them. Tony hands back the package to Nomad. Well, I say he hands it back to Nomad. He hands it to Nomad and asks Nomad to hand it back to the guy that he snatched it from earlier. Spider-Man says it looks like they've accomplished absolutely nothing. But then, after Tony says he doesn't want to be a member of the Butcher Dogs anymore, he wants to be like Nomad, and then Spidey and Nomad see Tony running along playing with a dustbin lid, pretending it's a shield, he acknowledges that actually, maybe he was wrong. Maybe they accomplished more than they thought. And then we see that next issue is Spider-Man and the Human Torch. Excellent. Mind you, on the letters page, it says in the bottom right corner, next issue is the Mighty Thor. Well, which is it? Human Torch or Thor? It's the Human Torch. I commented before on how issue 145 featured the last of 8 appearances by Iron Man in this series. Well, that's nothing. This comic features the last of 14 appearances from the Human Torch, and that's not even including 2 from the whole of the Fantastic Four. As you can see, the red and blue costume is back, and so is the Black Abbot. The day begins much like any other day, with 2 spaceships flying along the concrete canyons of Manhattan. One of them fires a missile at the other one. Now Spidey is sitting nearby, perched on a wall, and of course he can't have people being blown up in his city, can he? So he fires a bit of webbing at the missile to try to pull it off course. But what happens is that the missile pulls him off of the wall. So he does his best to affect its course while it's midair, and the result is that the missile slams into a big water tower. And as it explodes, all the water from the water tower pushes Spider-Man off at the top of the building. But he is seen falling from the top of the building by none other than Johnny Storm, aka the Human Torch. Torch flames on and flies over to save Spider-Man. Meanwhile, the 2 spaceships are continuing their little dogfight, and the inevitable happens. The one that was chasing the first ship does blow it up. So Human Torch drops Spidey somewhere safe, flies over to save the pilot. Meanwhile, as a couple of pedestrians are about to be crushed by the falling debris, Spider-Man swings in and saves them. With the second spaceship flying off and the Human Torch taking the injured pilot of the first ship to the hospital, there's nothing else for Spider-Man to do. So he swings home. Later on, whilst he's at home, he gets a visit from someone called Mr. Abbott, who's from the World Peace Association. He has come to see Peter because he and the World Peace Association have heard of Peter's great scientific gifts, and they want him to work on a project for them that will help with global peace. Now, whilst kindly old Mr. Abbott is saying this to Peter, it sounds good, but Peter's spider sense is going off. And I've got to say, the more I see of Mr. Abbott's face, the more I'm thinking his spider sense is probably right. But Peter decides to play along. so that he can visit Mr. Abbott at his base of operations. Meanwhile, the Human Torch is visiting that pilot in the hospital, and the pilot says to him that both he and the people in the ship that were chasing him work for the Black Abbot, but he was trying to escape from him. Black Abbot is planning a raid on Rikers Island prison. Speaking of the Black Abbot, it won't surprise you to hear that Mr. Abbott is the Black Abbot in disguise. And after he's shown Peter and some other new recruits round his base, Peter realises that a lot of the people there seem to be under some kind of mind control. The Human Torch arrives at the Black Abbot's base of operations and takes out one of the guards. But this is seen by the Black Abbot on one of his security monitors, and he then uses his mental powers to bury the Human Torch under a pile of earth. I'm not sure how that works either, because in no other part of this story is he shown to be telekinetic. Then, whilst the Human Torch is trapped under the earth, the Black Abbot sends a couple of his guys armed with stun blasters to knock him unconscious and bring him back to him. Meanwhile, Peter is still undercover, but he creates a little diversion and uses that to slip away so he can see what's really going on behind the scenes. In doing so, he gets a view at the security monitors, and on those he can see that the Black Abbot has got the Human Torch. It's at this point that the Black Abbot explains his grand plan. He is going to attack Rikers Island because he wants to free the convicts so they can join his growing army. As for the scientists, well, they are all working on some kind of amplifier that the Black Abbot can use to make himself even more powerful than he already is. Having explained his plan, the Black Abbot leaves. And he leaves the Torch, who's in a trance at this point, so he's completely harmless, in the care of a couple of his cronies. Spider-Man finally finds him, drops into the room and knocks out the two guys guarding him. He then says, "Come on, Torch, you and me, we can take them all on." But Torch, of course, doesn't respond because he's in this trance. So Spidey thinks, right, I've got to snap him out of it. So he throws a few insults at him, such as flame brain. I'm surprised that didn't get him going. And then he really goes for it and says, "It's a good thing your sister lost her baby. Any kid who had to grow up with you as an uncle is better off." That's a bit low, Spidey. I think I've gone off him actually after that. Anyway, it has the desired effect as Torch snaps out of it and completely loses it, and for a couple of panels attacks Spider-Man. Spidey explains though what he was doing and why he said that, so Torch calms down. He then explains to Spidey what the Black Abbot's plan is, and they of course set out to stop him. They find a huge hangar full of spaceships. The Black Abbot is there as well, but when he sees that both Spider-Man and the Human Torch are there, he bails. Spider-Man follows him whilst the Human Torch tries to take out of action as much of that little fleet as he can. In following the Black Abbot, Spider-Man discovers, what? That there's two of them. And this gives Spidey the opportunity to crack a great joke, which is that if one of those is the Black Abbot, the other one must be the Black Costello. They don't appreciate the joke and they both attack him with their psychic mind bolts. Meanwhile, back in the hangar, the Human Torch is doing okay. He's taking care of some of the people. And then he sees one of the bigger ships and blasts that just as it goes up into the sky. Because he's psychic, the Black Abbot is aware that this has happened, and he knows now that his plans are really taking a battering by these two. So one of the two Black Abbots decides to leave, leaving the other one to finish off Spidey. He intends to do this by using a prototype of the psychic amplifier that the scientists have been working on. The big question is, bearing in mind he has dissolved one of his own arms, how did he pick it up with one hand? Anyway, Spidey is a bit groggy, but he sees that there is some kind of power level setting on the side of the helmet, so he takes a risk and he sets it to maximum. This causes a power surge that knocks out the Black Abbot. Spider-Man, exhausted from the battle, also collapses and loses consciousness. He comes to with the Human Torch at his side. Unfortunately, the other Black Abbot has escaped, and we see him reporting to someone who looks like the Black Abbot but slightly different. Not only that, but there are some other, whisper it, clones there. Let's wrap this storyline up with issue 148, where, as you can see from this Al Milgrom cover, Spider-Man is joined by Thor. You remember Tony, The little kid from 146? Well, it looks like Nomad inspired him more than we realised, because he's now wandering around pretending to be a little mini nomad. He sees some kids graffitiing a wall, so he decides he's got to stop them. It doesn't go very well, because they turn on him, take the mick out of him and beat him up. He runs off, and while he's moping along the riverbank, he discovers a hidden tunnel. He follows it, and it leads him to a big underground hangar. And in that hangar are some familiar looking craft. Well, they look familiar to us anyway. Meanwhile, Spider-Man is at the hospital. He's visiting the Black Abbot. The Black Abbot, who's already lost his arm, and as we know as a result of the end of the previous issue, has now had some kind of mental overload as a result of that psychic amplifier. He's currently unconscious, but while Spider-Man is there, looking at him, he hears a sound, looks out the window, and it's those flying craft again. And as per the previous issue, they're firing a missile straight at the hospital room. Spidey manages to find some cover, but nonetheless the missile hits the room and it explodes. And that sound alerts who? Is it Don Blake? No, it's not. It's Sigurd Jarlsson. Doesn't matter. It's the mighty Thor. He flies outside, sees one of the ships still firing at the hospital, and so he takes it out. But there was a second ship, and he knows that the people that were in that ship are probably now inside the hospital. And he's right. But he needn't worry, because Spider-Man is dealing with them. And he's dealing with them just as security burst into the room. They, of course, think that Spider-Man is part of the problem, as always. But at that point, Thor enters the room and says, he's fine, he's with me. And of course, they're happy to take Thor at his word. At that point, the Black Abbot wakes up, but he explains that he is just an apostle of the real Black Abbot, and one of a number of apostles. And the real Black Abbot is actually much more powerful. He was being mind controlled by the Black Abbot, but when Spidey used that device to give him that mental overload, it broke that mind control. But the real Black Abbot knows this, and he now wants this guy dead. And Thor says he'll stay there as a bodyguard. The all-knowing Black Abbot is aware of this, and he knows that Thor is a very big challenge for him. He needs help. So he calls as many of his apostles from around the world to him as he can to augment his power. And we know that all around the world because quite handily, when we see them, they're always standing beside well-known landmarks. Only 7 of his apostles respond quickly, but that's fine. He says 7 should be enough to do the job. Meanwhile, Thor is still at the hospital, guarding over the injured Black Abbot. And that injured guy now wakes up from a nightmare. But it's a nightmare that was linked to the real Black Abbot's mind, and he knows that he's preparing a massive evil. And they, this guy and Thor, need to go to the Black Abbot's hideout to put a stop to it. And that's exactly what they do. But it's a trap. Yes, that guy had freed himself from the Black Abbot's mind control, but during the night when he was asleep, again the Abbot took control of him. And he now leads Thor, an unsuspecting Thor, into the Black Abbot's HQ, and once he's in there, all 7 of the Black Abbot's acolytes attack him with their psychic bolts. He throws his hammer at them, but they open up a portal, which then makes the hammer appear behind Thor and takes him out. He is now unconscious. And not only that, but the Black Abbot has improved on his psychic amplifier. And his plan now is to use that to take control of Thor. Spidey arrives back at the hospital, surprised, of course, to find that neither Thor nor the injured Abbot are there. He asks a member of staff where they are, and all she can tell him is that the prisoner mentioned something about the Upper West Side, and that's it. So that's all Spidey's got to go on. He leaves the hospital and heads to the Upper West Side. Whilst he's en route, someone throws a dustbin lid at him, which is a bit weird. But he looks down. Who is it? It's Tony. And Tony says, "I'm glad I saw you." And then he tells him about the hangar he found with some weird jets in it. And Spidey says, "Weird jets? Tell me more." So Tony takes him to where this hangar is. And they find the entrance, and Spidey says, "Right, nice one, Tony. I'll tell you what, go and call the Fantastic Four and the Avengers." And he gives him 2 specific memories that only Spider-Man would know, so that when this kid rings them, they know it's genuine. And that's brilliant. I want to see more of this. Normally, in solo books, when there's some big threat, a threat that you know full well the FF or the Avengers would normally deal with, Spider-Man or whoever it is says, oh, it's a shame the FF are out of town. Not on this occasion. They're in town. Go get them. Sadly, it doesn't turn out the way that any of us, especially Spider-Man, were hoping. Because Tony gets the special memories mixed up. So he speaks to Jarvis at Avengers Mansion and says, oh yes, Spider-Man always meets up with the Avengers at the Statue of Liberty. And of course Jarvis is saying, what are you talking about? No, he doesn't. And then he rings the Fantastic Four and says that Spider-Man helped them recently defeat the Lava Men. But the robotic receptionist says, there's no record of Spider-Man helping the Fantastic Four fight the Lava Men at all. So it's clearly a crank call. So much for that idea. Spider-Man, meanwhile, is doing okay. He's in the underground complex and he has found Thor. He takes out 2 of the apostles that were guarding Thor and then picks up the unconscious Thunder God and makes a run for it. However, all of the apostles and the Black Abbot are psychically linked. So when he knocks those 2 out, everybody else was aware of it, and 3 more have appeared. They chase after him and hit him with another one of those darned psychic bolts. At that point though, Thor regains consciousness and calls his hammer to him. Once in possession of it, he uses it to whip up a storm to deal with those abbots in the room. The real Black Abbot sees this and really starts panicking because, as he puts it, he sees so many of his bodies unconscious. He needs to get out of there. As he leaves, Tony appears. Now Tony found that entrance again to the underground complex, worked his way through the tunnels and just popped out of an air vent at the wrong time. So the Black Abbot grabs him and takes him hostage. He runs with him and jumps into one of the aircraft and begins to leave. Now Spider-Man is still a bit groggy after his latest attack from psychic bolts. And Thor, Thor could whip up a thunderstorm, but he still can't stand. That's pushing it. But he can also throw his hammer, which he does. He throws it at the little craft and he says to Spider-Man, as it flies past you, grab hold of it. And Spidey does, and that takes him to the craft. He lands on it, rips off the top and rescues Tony. So Tony is safe, but sadly so too is the Black Abbot, because he does escape. And Spider-Man thinks, I bet we'll meet again someday. Well, they didn't. The Black Abbot tangled with the Punisher, but that was about it, which is a shame because he seemed like a really good, sinister, powerful villain. And we know that at least 5 of his apostles are still out there somewhere in the world. Nonetheless, they didn't use him much after this. Thor then tells off Tony for entering the lair and putting himself at risk. But he also thanks him and says that because of him, Spider-Man was able to find Thor and save him. Yeah, well done, Tony. If it wasn't for you screwing up the message, the Fantastic Four or the Avengers or both of them could have arrived and actually captured the Black Abbot and stopped his evil schemes dead in their tracks. Well done, stupid kid. The last panel reads like one of those moralistic messages at the end of old Thundercats or He-Man episodes, as Thor says, everyone can aid in some way in the fight against evil, if they but have the courage. And then Spidey says, he says it better than I do, Tony, but what he means is, thanks. If it's possible to have a change of direction with just 2 issues left to go in the series, then this is it. As from issue 149, we have a new regular writer, Louise Simonson. Louise Simonson is another classic Marvel writer who wrote some classic 1980s titles. But don't get me wrong, she has continued to work right up until the present day. She wrote numerous issues of The New Mutants, had an epic 58-issue run on X Factor, during which time she wrote Apocalypse's first storyline, and she launched Power Pack. Her run with Spider-Man is a little bit odd. It included the last 2 issues of this series, which were both one-and-done tales, including the double-sized last issue, and then the first 3 issues of Web of Spider-Man, including issue 1, with that epic final battle with the alien suit. Spoilers! It wasn't. She didn't only work for Marvel. A new decade saw Louise move to a new publisher as she spent the 90s with DC, during which time she produced another epic run, this time on Superman, the Man of Steel. This issue features a nice little story about a character called the Incandescent Man. And at the end of it, he goes missing, and there is the likelihood that he will return in a future Spider-Man comic. He didn't. And that brings us to the big one, issue 150, with an awesome cover by Barry Windsor Smith. Anyway, sales for Marvel Team Up had been healthy as they had ever been in fact. But as storytelling became more sophisticated in the 1980s, so publishers abandoned the restrictive team-up concept. In 1983, DC brought an end to the long-running Batman team-up title, The Brave and the Bold. That same year, Marvel cancelled the Things team-up title, Marvel 2-in-1, and replaced it with a solo title for him. And now, 2 years after that, and 1 year before DC cancelled their other big team-up title, World's Finest Comics, Marvel were cancelling Spider-Man's team-up title to replace it with a solo title for him. Of course, if you want to end a team-up series with a bang, who do you have? Of course, it's the X-Men. Well, some of them anyway. After we see Peter trying and failing to avoid his landlady, Mrs. Muggins, because it's rent day and, as usual, he doesn't have the rent, we have a massive change of scenery as we head to a jungle over Asia, and we see a plane. And in that plane is the Juggernaut. He's there because he wants to seek out the Temple of Chitarak. Sitorak, whatever it's called, he wants to find it. He jumps from the airplane and lands in an armoured column below. Now the soldiers, of course, don't know what to make of this. They just see an object hit the ground and leave a massive crater. So they go and have a look at what they call the wreckage, but someone says, there's no wreckage, it's alive. Indeed, it is alive, and it's got attitude. And the troops there, the guerrilla troops, open fire on him, not just with handguns, but also there's a tank there. But the bullets bounce off of him, and he's very dismissive of the whole attack. And he points out, the last person that even slowed me down was Spider-Man, which is a nice nod to the classic storyline in issues 229 and 230 of The Amazing Spider-Man. Brilliant storyline, that. He finishes off the troops by picking up one tank and using it to batter the other tank, and then he just strolls off. He walks through the jungle because, as I said, he's looking for the Temple of Chitarak, in which he'll find the Ruby of Chitarak, which of course is what originally gave him his Juggernaut powers. He finds it. He wants the ruby as a birthday present for his friend, Black Tom Cassidy, a man more Irish than anybody in the whole wide world, except probably Shamrock. After a brief interlude where we see Peter Parker bumping into Candy, who is the niece of his landlady, and her friends Randy and Bambi. Now they had a habit of always sunbathing on the roof of the apartment block, which made life difficult for Peter as he tried to get out through the skylight as Spider-Man. Anyway, he mentions to them that he's a photographer, and they suggest he comes up, takes some pictures of them in their bikinis, and maybe has a spot of lunch. Then we head to upstate New York and Charles Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters. And there, in the danger room, we see some of the gifted youngsters themselves, the X-Men, in training. Nightcrawler is at the control panel, and Colossus and Rogue are facing the trials of the danger room. Now, Greg LaRocque, I think, has done a good job in the issues of Marvel Team Up that we've seen his work in. But when it comes to Colossus, he's just not big enough. Now, I know Colossus isn't normally built like, say, the Hulk, or the Rhino, or even the Juggernaut. But he's bigger than that. That looks like I would look if I chose to wear the same kind of unflattering costume. There is one more X-Man that we see in this issue, and that is Phoenix, by which I mean Rachel Summers, the future daughter of Scott Summers and Jean Grey that's come back to the present. She isn't in the danger room because she's making dinner for them, and she calls them up psychically, of course. And while they're sitting there eating their dinner, they see on the news the Juggernaut, and they see footage of him in Asia, in Korea to be specific. They see him leaving the temple, and they see him holding the Ruby of Chitarak. And they recognise the Ruby as well, and they're wondering, what is he up to? Now Rachel thinks that it may be that he wants to share the power of Chitarak with Black Tom, because that's actually what he did in her alternate future. Peter Parker is also sitting down watching the news, and he sees a report of the Juggernaut with the Ruby of Chitarak. We then visit the apartment of Black Tom, and Juggernaut has just arrived, carrying his neatly wrapped present in his hands. And Black Tom kind of mocks him for arriving in costume. Well, what's he come as? Juggernaut gives him the present. Black Tom opens it and says, "Oh, a ruby, how lovely." But then on touching it, something happens and he suddenly swells and grows, and he now has some of the power of the Juggernaut. Back at the X-Mansion, Rachel has shared her concerns with the rest of the team, so Nightcrawler has used Cerebro to find Black Tom. And now the team, well, this small part of the team, are going to head out to find him. When it comes to Black Tom, he isn't happy, because although Juggernaut gave him this gift that gave him great power, he's swollen, he's much bigger than he was, and he doesn't want the power. He tells Juggernaut to put him back the way he was, but Juggernaut says he can't. And Black Tom takes that badly, punches Juggernaut, and Juggernaut goes flying out the window, down several stories to the ground below. Now the point here is that Juggernaut felt that, and he's not used to feeling punches. He climbs back up the side of the building to Black Tom's apartment, grabs Tom, punches him, and now Tom is the one flying down to the ground. Juggernaut soon joins him though, and Black Tom comes out of the wreckage of the crater that they both made, saying, "What do you mean hitting me like that, you fool? A fall like that'll coulda be... A fall like that'll coulda been the death of me." I don't know if that's a typo, or if the writer has just gone into Irish overdrive, but it's gibberish. Juggernaut is now a bit smaller than he was before, and a bit weaker, although he is still very strong. Black Tom, of course, is bigger than he was, and a bit stronger. So what's happened here is that the power of the Ruby of Chitarak is limited. So rather than them both having the strength of the original Juggernaut, they both have half of that strength. All this fighting in the street has caught the attention of who? Exactly, Spider-Man. He attends the scene, but he holds back and uses his camera to try to get some pictures to sell to the Daily Bugle. But Black Tom and the Juggernaut spot him, and they say that although they have half of the Juggernaut's power each, the two of them together should be able to take him on. The Juggernaut is first to launch his attack, although of course he misses and goes straight through a wall, and then it's Black Tom's turn to start the assault. But not until he's thought through the situation in Irish, as indicated by the abundance of apostrophes in his thought bubbles. And it's in this kind of situation where we see Spider-Man at his best, because he isn't the strongest superhero in the world. Nowhere near. He's nowhere near as strong as Juggernaut, even now that Juggernaut is half the strength he used to be. And nowhere near as strong as the Juggernaut and Black Tom. Nonetheless, he uses his agility, his wits, his cunning, all those kind of things, to outsmart them. And to basically get the upper hand where rightfully he shouldn't. But he does. But it doesn't last. Soon the tables are turned and he is almost defeated when the X-Men show up. This is the first time that Spider-Man has crossed paths with the X-Men since the Secret Wars, where they sided with Magneto. And he thinks to himself that they will probably side with the villains on this occasion too. They don't, and straight away Black Tom fires a burst of bioenergy through his shillelagh at Colossus. And he says, "Charmed, I'm sure." I think the writers probably meant to say, "Charmed, to be sure." So it is. It's time for a fight. We have Colossus lifting up the pavement to try to knock Tom off of his feet. We then have Black Tom pick up a whole building. And we have Nightcrawler teleporting around Tom and hitting him, but his punches have no effect. Juggernaut then picks up a car and throws that at Spider-Man, but Colossus gets in the way and blocks it. Black Tom grabs a hold of Nightcrawler. And it's at that point that Rogue thinks, right, something has to be done to turn the tables here. So she thinks all that can be done is that she bares her skin and touches Black Tom and absorbs his power. But she's quite hesitant in case, again, as with Carol Danvers, she absorbs his powers, his psyche, and they never leave her. But then she thinks, I'm an X-Man now, which she seemed to constantly be thinking around this period. She absorbs the half of the Juggernaut's power that Black Tom had, and then she goes toe-to-toe with Juggernaut himself. Phoenix tries to hit Juggernaut with a psionic blast, but it doesn't work because he's wearing his helmet. So Rogue grabs a hold of it and tries to pull it off of him. But as she does so, the power of the Juggernaut begins to leave her. but it doesn't return to Black Tom. Colossus now leaps at Juggernaut's legs whilst Juggernaut is trying to crush Rogue, and Colossus manages to pull Juggernaut's helmet off, only to discover there's another smaller helmet underneath as a kind of insurance. So Phoenix's attacks are still ineffective. Rogue again touches skin. This time it's the Juggernaut's, and she absorbs his part of the Juggernaut power, and he actually shrinks down to normal size. Again, Rogue now has the power of the Juggernaut, or at least half of it, and she also has all of his memories, his bitter memories about Charles Xavier. This drives her a little bit crazy, and she attacks Spider-Man, but she misses him, and as Juggernaut did earlier in the issue, ends up going through a wall. Now she quickly loses that power, so she doesn't have it, Black Tom doesn't have it. So where is it? It's back in the Ruby, but the Ruby is now in the hands of Cain Marko, meaning he is back to normal with the full power of the Juggernaut. Just to make sure that nobody else can take some of that power from him, he launches the Ruby into orbit. Spider-Man and the X-Men are girding themselves for round 2 of the battle when they hear a crash and see that Black Tom and the Juggernaut have escaped into the sewers of New York. And they decide not to follow them in case they cause more damage underground. We follow them though, and we see Black Tom saying to the Juggernaut that although he didn't want the Ruby, having it gave him an insight into how it must feel for Cain to have that power. Back topside, we see Colossus shaking hands with Spider-Man and saying how surprised he is that Spidey managed to hold off both of those two on his own. Well, he shouldn't be surprised after Spider-Man pissed all over the X-Men during the Secret Wars. Then they hear police sirens, and neither Spider-Man nor the X-Men are popular with police, so all of them leave the scene. Spidey heads straight to the Daily Bugle to develop his photos, but apart from the ones of Candy, Randy and Bambi sunbathing on the roof, none of the others, the pictures of the battle, came out because web fluid had gunked up the inside of the camera. He is distraught because he wanted to buy Aunt May a new hat from Saks. However, Robbie Robertson thinks that the pictures of the sunbathing girls in their bikinis are perfect. For a story on the heatwave, of course. And he says to Peter, "Who knows, this might be the beginning of a whole new career." Oh no, I did that last time, didn't I? Thus, the sun set on a classic Spider-Man series. Okay, he didn't feature in every issue. In fact, there were 9 that featured either the Hulk or the Human Torch in the lead role, with no sign of Spider-Man at all. But make no mistake, this was his series. But the team-up approach was restrictive and repetitive. Reading several issues in a short span of time is quite challenging and highlights the weaknesses of the format. The demise of this title, along with the likes of Power Man and Iron Fist and the Defenders, all marked steps on the transition from the Bronze to the modern age. The 90s and 2000s saw attempts to revive the title, but none of them have lasted anywhere near as long as the original. Any sadness at the passing of this comic was eclipsed by the joy of what was to replace it, as Web of Spider-Man completed the holy trinity of Spider-Man titles, alongside the Amazing and Spectacular. But that is a story for another day. Good night.